edition of the NERI's seminar series. Just to note that this is being recorded. First of all, I'd like to introduce Michael Taft, our presenter here today. Many of you will know that Michael is a research officer with SIPTU, formerly Unite. He's author of the Notes on the Front blog on political economy. Just so you know, that blog is now at a new site. Michael might tell you the URL in a minute. He is also a member of the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, and Michael is also a member of the Low Pay Commission. So a very, very busy man. Michael is also one of the authors of the Labour Movement's new economic model, which I myself participated in. I just, while I have the opportunity, like to let you all know about our upcoming seminars. Our next seminar will be on the 5th of November at 3:30 online. Kevin O'Kelly, Industrial Relations and EU Social Policy researcher, will present on the impact of artificial intelligence on employment relations, a European studies. Details will be on the NERI website. And then the 13th annual Donald Nevin lecture is going to take place in Queen's Business School, Belfast, on the 22nd of January from 5:30 to 8 o'clock in the evening, followed by a drinks reception. Sarah O'Connor, who is the employment correspondent with the Financial Times, will be presenting on changes in employment law in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And we will have more details regarding that on our website. So anyone who wants to contribute later on, please raise your hand, and we will definitely get to your question or open the floor to you indeed. Just to note as well, obviously there's been a lot of reaction to the budget so far, but I would certainly point people towards Social Justice Ireland's publication that they already have out, amazingly, as they always do, so early. Excellent piece of research as always, and once you've finished with this seminar, I recommend heading on over there and giving it a read. So Michael is going to talk for around 25 minutes, I think, Michael.
Yeah.
But give or take, we won't worry about it too much. And then after that, we will have a questions and answer session, and I'll have some questions myself too. So with that, I'll stop talking, and I'm going to pass you over to Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to NERI and Louisa for setting me up here in the ICTU offices to make this presentation. I'm not going to go through, I'm not going to do a kind of a descriptive thing and then comment on every kind of sector, echoing what Tom said. If you want to, find out more on social protection and poverty issues, the place to go is the Social Justice Ireland publication. So I just want to hit on 2 or 3 things and try to see if we can get pull a story out rather than hit you with a lot of stats. There'll be some stats there, of course, and see where we get. So first off, a little background music before we get into Budget 26, just to let people know. As you can see here, from just prior to COVID in 2019, all the way up to recent, profits have increased by 70%, while about 72%, while wages have increased by about 40%. So profits are, going up much faster than wages over this last 6-year period, covering the COVID and cost of living crisis. And a recent Department of Finance survey found that in 2024, over 70% of SMEs were in profit, compared to about 8% who were in loss. And that's a higher level of profitability than before COVID and the cost of living crisis. So that might help us put some perspective on these issues about SMEs, small businesses, or the business sector in general being under pressure. By the way, that 72% increase in profits, that's just domestic. That's just domestic. It excludes the multinationals. Second piece of background news is net wealth holdings. This is courtesy of the European Central Bank. And what we find is that net wealth, that's assets minus liabilities. Assets include real estate, real property, land, housing, but also includes bonds and shares, financial property. You can see it's heavily concentrated in the top 10% income group. On average, people in the top 10% income group or wealth holding group hold over €1 million per adult and child. Over €1 million, whereas you can see the bottom 50% has a very low amount of holdings. So it's just to note that it's not just the fact that the 10% own 23 times the amount that the bottom 50%, they also hold multiples of median, middle income earners. So they really are set apart in that respect. And the third piece, the final piece of our background music is annual earnings. That's employee or self-employed income. As you can see, the 95th percentile, the top 5%, have seen their annual earnings increase by 44% since 2011, whereas the median earner has seen it by 30%. Now, just a big caveat, this is just earnings through PAYE and self-employed. This doesn't include capital income. If it included capital income, and it's very hard to measure that. I mean, revenue and the CSO are just measuring the payroll. If it included capital income, that gap between the top 5% and the rest of us would rise extraordinarily, because at that level, at that very high level, they take by as much by capital income as earnings. So there we have profits, concentration of wealth, and a widening gap between the very top earners and the median income. So let's first go to fiscal management. Fiscal management, it's one of the first rules of government to have sound management of public finances. I know that when you hear the term, oh, we must have sound public finances and sound financial management, it sometimes sounds like, you know, you're coming from the right. Well, it's not a matter of right or left. Shoddy fiscal management can really screw you up. And we've had two cases like that. Prior to the crash, the government fueled a property boom with spending increases and tax cuts being subsidized by property speculation. After the crash, the government pursued austerity with spending cuts and tax increases. Both these policies were pro-cyclical, and they can lead to a series of boom and bust economic cycles. So what's happening today? Well, the government still hasn't learned its lesson. It's still running pro-cyclical policies. The government is actually running a deficit. So when you hear about, oh, it's luckily we have the Minister for Finance, the very steady hand at the helm, follows prudent principles. No, that's nonsense. The government is actually running a deficit at this stage. Wholly irresponsible when the economy is at or near full capacity. And the deficit we're referring to is called the economic or underlying deficit. That is, if you remove the windfall corporate tax receipts, what do you have left? And as you can see, it has risen dramatically since 2023, and it's anticipated to be 14 billion euros next year. Two things about this. Why should we care? First off, it fuels inflationary pressures. If you are spending more than what the economy is generating, you are teeing up in bouts of inflation, periods of inflation. When they occur, where they occur, we cannot say, but you know, that's a reasonable assumption. Further, if it limits future fiscal maneuverability in the event of a downturn or slump, and we live in a market economy, there's going to be a downturn. There's going to be a slump. That's just the nature of it. What you don't do is add to it by running pro-cyclical policies. So how is the government funding this deficit? Why aren't we out in the international market borrowing, paying more interest payments and all that? How is it funding? It is relying on these windfall corporate tax receipts, and let's call this for what it is. This is tax avoidance money produced by a handful of US multinationals, 3, maybe 4, that use their legal and accounting strategies to shift profits here away from other jurisdictions. And as you can see, this year, the level of those windfall corporate tax receipts will be about 15 billion euros. Over the last decade, including the Apple money, the government has received over 100 billion euros in these windfall receipts, and they've saved only 16 billion of them. Now, the reliance on multinational tax receipts is a dangerous place to be. What happens if the windfall receipts start to decline? What happens if even just one of those multinationals, one of them, actually decides that they're going to shift their profits somewhere else for whatever reason? It may well be to satisfy Donald Trump back in the US, to show that they're now repatriating profits, whereas it used to go to Ireland, now it's going to go to New York or Boston or whatever, to the US. What happens in that situation? All of a sudden, that money that we are relying on starts to shrink. Or the same thing, what happens? We go into a downturn. What happens if the two things combine? We could be facing a new bout of austerity. This is a highly irresponsible fiscal stance, endangering the bottom line while unnecessarily fueling inflation. To be honest, based on the last 25 years, from pre-crash to austerity to what's been happening now, it is clear that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael cannot be trusted with our public finances. Let's talk about infrastructure. That's one of the areas where there's a lot of agreement. I don't mean to throw cold water on this, but I'll just throw a thimbleful of cold water on this, but we should be aware of this. First off, we should be aware of the hole we have dug ourselves in when we compare ourselves to other EU peer group countries. This is from the Fiscal Council. We are public capital stock, which is essentially our infrastructural investment, is about 25% below our peer group in the EU. So if you looked at the period between 2007 and 2021, which is what the Fiscal Council did, if capital investment maintained that trend, it would be about, I calculated, 128 years before we'd catch up with the average of the European peer group. I know it's nice to have a long-term strategy, but that just takes it to another realm. However, thankfully, the government has quickened the pace of increasing capital spending. So we should be able to close that gap in a lot shorter time, but it's still going to be years of high levels of capital spending before we do close that gap. Whether that gap be in energy, water, transport, health and education, physical assets, homes. But there's one thing we have to bear in mind. The challenges to our infrastructural spending is not that we don't have the money. A lot of that infrastructural spending, especially in the area of green technologies, that is something that you would use the windfall corporate tax receipts for. So it's not the money, but there's three areas that we're going to have to focus on. That's economic infrastructure, broadly covered by the National Development Plan. Tomorrow, we would need to build 250,000 houses just to raise our housing stock to EU levels. And we have a target of retrofitting 500,000 houses and installing 400,000 heat pumps by 2030. This all requires labor. And the ESRI states that there isn't the labor to achieve those objectives. So we may wish to increase our spending on these areas, but without the labor there, it's just not going to happen. And if we keep throwing money at it, we will fuel inflation and produce poor value. So numbers on a page doesn't necessarily make it so. The second area, it's actually the third area, pardon my numbering. This is what happens when you're trying to produce something within 24 hours of the budget. The third area is competitiveness. The government is trying to sell this budget as promoting competitiveness. Let's cut to the chase on this one. Budget 2026 will not increase productivity. And productivity is the only measure we have for competitiveness. Competitiveness is one of those woolly and wobbly concepts that can mean anything you want, any time of the day you want. But productivity, at least, is something concrete. It's not going to increase productivity. The Irish domestic economy has the lowest productivity, that is value added per hour worked, in any other EU peer group domestic economy. And addressing productivity is hard work. It requires infrastructure, business investment, tackling peripherality, overcoming lack of scale, managerial deficits, access to capital, and in particular, it requires a stakeholder approach whereby one of those stakeholders' employees have similar rights in terms of negotiating with the employers or participating in the decision-making process of the firm. That is all very hard work. It requires new institutions and new practices, new business practices. While that requires a lot of hard work, tax cuts are easy. And tax cuts give the semblance of doing something, even though it may only serve to promote profits with no guarantee that those profits will be reinvested. Let's take a look at two tax cuts by way of example. Hospitality sector. I think we're all sick and tired of hearing about the tax cut on food services. But just to remind ourselves, over the last 6 years, since just prior to COVID, profits in the hospitality sector trebled compared to profits in the domestic sector increasing by about half of that. And 20% of the VAT cut benefit will go to restaurants and cafes, only 20%. It's 700 billion euros, and only 140 million of that will go to restaurants and cafes, 40% to fast food outlets. It's an extremely inefficient and ineffective way to subsidize restaurants and cafes if you happen to believe that they need subsidizing, which there is no clear evidence that it does. But probably what's even more insidious is the VAT cut on new apartment builds. I would strongly recommend that you Google, and you search on social media or whatever for the commentary by Orla Hegarty, an assistant professor at the UCD, assistant professor of architecture, who's done a considerable amount of work in this area, trying to show actually what happens in the real world. Never mind what happens on paper. Oh, a VAT cut's going to reduce this, and that'll mean more, more apartments or lower price. Well, that all looks good on paper. What's happening in the real world? She says that calls to cut VAT and zone more land isn't to make housing more affordable, it's to make development more profitable. The fact is we cannot rely on VAT cuts to either reduce new apartment prices or, as the government stated aim, increasing additional units. Because quite simply, in a supply-demand market where demand greatly outstrips supply, if you cut the tax on that supply, it could easily seep into higher land prices and development margins. And even if you do succeed in building extra apartments, how many, we don't know. The government doesn't have a target. They have not published a paper to go through this. But even if they could, with new apartments reaching nearly 600,000 in Dublin and monthly rents in apartments exceeding 2,200, even if supply increased, it would still be out of the reach of most purchasers and tenants. So the government claims that this VAT cut for apartments is about viability. And again, referred to Orla Hegarty, working off government's own documents. The profit per unit on urban apartments is 48,000. Developers will make 48,000, nearly 49,000 euros on each unit of an urban apartment. The VAT cut will add 20,000 to that margin. So on the minister's own figures, that's almost 70,000 euros profit on an incentive for building a 2-bed urban apartment. That's, it's back to the old days. If you want to incentivize the poor, you take money away from them. If you want to incentivize the rich and economically powerful, you give them money. And that's exactly what's happening. And there's no guarantee that that will translate into additional apartments. So what's the real story here? The real story is that the government does not have a coherent strategy to promote competitiveness and productivity. It equates competitiveness with tax cuts and wage suppression. For instance, postponing the living wage. They are captured by employees who dominate the debate. There's no guarantee tax cuts will reduce closures, such as restaurants, increase supply, such as housing, or promote productive investment, not to any significant extent. Quite simply, all that public money, most of that public money could actually be absorbed back into profits and high-income individuals. Let's look at it another way. If you wanted to use 700 million euros, which is the price of the hospitality VAT cut, if you wanted to use 700 million euros on competitiveness, you would mobilize labor, capital, assets into high-value sectors. You wouldn't throw it into one of the lowest value-added, low-wage sector in the economy, namely hospitality. So what would be a progressive response? Well, we don't have one right now. We've got bits of one. So far, the response to the budget has been to show that the failure to even moderately inflation index tax credits and tax bans is actually subsidizing these employer and developer tax cuts. This is valid. It's true. However, we must deepen our critique, namely that a tax-cutting agenda will not increase competitiveness or productivity. We need to acknowledge, as per the NERI SIPTU study, that domestic productivity is weak. This requires a new progressive agenda for competitiveness and productivity to challenge the government's current agenda. And may I just say, and I'm not meaning to be critical, and if I'm incorrect, please pull me up on it. But when the government about 2 weeks ago published its Competitiveness and Productivity Action Plan, SIPTU released a statement criticizing it. SIPTU issued a statement criticizing it for not, getting at the real drivers of productivity, but not one of the opposition parties issued a statement. We are absent from that debate. As if you take the progressive forces as a whole, we are absent from that debate. We're leaving it to the employers to define competitiveness, to define productivity, relying on the government to do that. We shouldn't. We have to get into that debate, and not with kind of knee-jerk kind of reactions, such as cutting tax. Now, this is a little bit aside. Oh, geez. I just got this last minute. In fact, just as I was sending this off to NERI, Tom McDonnell sent me over these graphs from today's Parliamentary Budget Office publication. I think they published it today. And here's one of the graphs. It's a very provocative graph. One would really like to see the full report, but I thought it was one just put up, especially as I heard Miel Martin on the 1 o'clock news say that this budget was looking after the most vulnerable in society. Well, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, that's not the case. As you can see, on average, low, middle, and high income households face average income losses from budget 2026. But when you look at the graph, it's actually the first and second decile, the lowest 20% that actually are the real losers compared to the rest of the population. So much for protecting the most vulnerable. Now I'm going to. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. I am. I'm going to go very quickly. What a progressive budget could have looked like, and I want to base this on the new economic model, which was a a new framework for understanding the economic challenges that we face, social, economic, environmental challenges, and the type of policies to meet those challenges. This was adopted by the SIPTU BDC earlier this year after 2 years' work by a small group of people, including Tom and myself. I just want to take 4 areas to give an example of what we might have done differently if we were in charge of budget 2026. The first thing is you need to move towards a counter-cyclical budget. You need to do that. You need to decouple for your reliance on multinational money, which could easily move away or start to shrink. And that actually means, and this is a tough sell, there's no question about it. This is a tough sell, but we need to chart out an agenda whereby we can close the economic or underlying deficit over a period of 5 to 7 years without impacting living standards or economic efficiency. That would mean that instead of 1.3 billion euros in tax cuts that budget 2026 provided, we would need 1.3 billion euros in tax increases. And the best template for those tax increases, I think, comes from the Commission on Taxation and Social Welfare, which, excuse me, which called for materially increasing taxes on capital, property, and assets. This would avoid taxes on labor and shift the tax base to higher income and wealth holding groups that we saw are doing quite well and getting better all the time. That's the background music playing in our heads. The second thing is improving public sector efficiency. Apparently, the HSE executives and senior management from the HSE visited Ryanair's headquarters to learn how the airline manages aircraft dispatch and punctuality to apply similar lessons to hospital overcrowding. I don't know where you would start with that kind of process. What I find, though, I mean, listen, wherever you can get good advice, you get good advice. Patients, however, are not aircraft that are something around the runway. But what's really the key thing is that there's almost no emphasis on consulting with the one group who knows the most about the operation of the health system, namely the employees, the women and men who actually produce the service. So therefore, something based on the new economic model would actually promote a drive of employee-led innovation and productivity, whereby employees drive the process of increasing productivity in a democratic bottom-up approach. Now, this should be done throughout the economy, public sector, private sector, community sector, whatever. But the fact is the public sector can be a model for that process, provide a demonstration effect. And if the government won't do this after being pressed, trade unions should consider doing it themselves, mobilizing their own resources. We have an enormous amount of human capital that knows how these things run and don't run, whether it's health or education, whether it's a construction firm or a big tech firm or whatever. There's no reason why the trade union movement couldn't actually launch such an employee-driven innovation drive, and with the assistance of supportive academics and lessons from abroad. Just remember, if we don't drive the reform agenda, and be very clear, if there is a squeeze in the years ahead, just like there's been a bit of a squeeze this year, but if there's a squeeze in the year ahead, they are going to come out from the long grass, and they will take every deficit, every kind of problem in the public sector, and cynically exploit that to say, look at all the waste. We need to privatize. We need to outsource. We need to do all that type of stuff. So if we don't drive the reform agenda, they will, and they will be driven by people who are not very sympathetic to public provision. Just 2 more points. Third point, I say, listen to the market. The market is trying to tell us things. I know that sounds strange from a left or progressive point of view, trade unionist point of view, but it's true. For instance, the market tells us that when it comes to nursing homes provision, it requires a substantial state subsidy, because without that state subsidy, only the highest income groups would get a nursing home place. So if we left it to the market, we'd effectively have no nursing homes except for the very rich. Same thing with childcare. 60% of providers' revenues come from state subsidy. Without this, few people could afford it. Now, apply this to affordable homes, whether that's affordable purchase or affordable rent. Is the market telling us that it cannot produce truly affordable homes on its own? If so, we have a choice, a very big choice. We can subsidize private actors, the private sector, as we do in the nursing homes, as we do with childcare. We can subsidize private actors to produce that. And that can be very costly, as we find in the nursing home and childcare sector. Or we can provide affordable housing directly through the public realm and leave high-end accommodation to the private sector. Making that choice, and that's a big choice, will require a different agenda. No more incrementalism, no more tinkering with market adjustments. We need to offer solutions that are as big as the problems people are facing. In other words, what we need is good old-fashioned supply-side socialism. And the last point I'll make in terms of what we could have done, a lot of progressives in the budget called for continuation of electricity credits. Problem is that this is a situation of subsidies chasing prices. We need better tools. We should go in and reshape the electricity price market with block tariffs. In other words, the more you consume, the more you pay. It's like income tax. Here's a crude example. You provide the first 20% of average electricity consumption for free, much like a tax-free credit. Set a standard rate above that 20% threshold, and you set a higher rate for households that consume double the average electricity consumption. That would a lot of caveats, it would have to be, there's a lot of that detail that would have to be worked out, but it could significantly reduce fuel poverty, reverse the regressive scale of consumption, and incentivize energy efficiency for high-income groups, that is, those who can afford it. That is about reshaping markets to serve social needs rather than just the state spending money to chase after the prices that the private sector sets. So, on to Budget 2027. Here we're seeing progressive fiscal management, economic and workplace democracy, public provision and universal basic services, reducing living costs through reshaping markets. These are just some of the principles informing the new economic model. And by the way, those are not set proposals. There's many ways to go about doing each one of those things. So that's where we have the debate. But this is the framework that the new economic model provides us, in which we can have that debate. So this is about a national conversation over an alternative model of development, growth, and prosperity. And if we want to influence Budget 2027, we have to start now. Remember, the Restaurant Association of Ireland was campaigning for 2 years to get that VAT cut. 2 years. Okay, so they have the advantage that they can focus on one issue. But we have to, if we want to influence 2027, it's not a matter of putting in a submission like in June, July, or August, issuing a statement or two. We have to campaign on clear, identifiable points that can make a difference to people, so that we are put in a position of influence over the public debate, and over time put the economic orthodoxy on the defensive. And if I could just summarize this entire presentation, in short, really, it's all about democratizing everything. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting indeed, as always. So that allows us to open the floor to anyone who might have comments or questions. Say who you are. Just raise your hand. I can pick you out. Nobody yet, but they'll come, I'm sure. So let me start. Okay. clear identifiable points. You say the Restaurant Association, tourism industry in general, spent 2 years campaigning to get what they wanted on that. You know, evidence ultimately didn't matter. You could go on the media and provide anything that you wanted. It ultimately didn't matter. It was ineffective. What are the lessons that we can learn from that? And in the sense of, you mentioned clear identifiable points, and there have to be a small number of them. What would you identify as 3 that the broader progressive movement could push on over the next 2 years to try and get them manifest as budget policies? Just 3. Easy.
I don't know if I could define 3, but I would say this.
But you have to restrict it. Just pick 3.
Okay, well, first off, I'd say issues of affordability, issues that actually impact on people's lives. And I think that the new economic model's emphasis on the universal basic services, which is to provide public services for free or at such a low cost that it is not a barrier to participation, I think that's key in the areas of health, education, public transport, and housing. You know, I mean, a lot of politicians in the US are scoring a lot of successes running on the issues of affordability. Affordability is an issue throughout Europe. That's certainly one I would take on. Secondly, you know, I probably wouldn't say counter-cyclical budget because that'll put everybody to friggin' sleep and no one will know what you're talking about. We have to do things that impact on people's lives. So the second thing, what are the most expensive things compared to the rest of Europe that drives our living costs up to, you know, the top of the EU table is housing and utilities. So therefore, housing has to be a key point. You can say that as a standalone or part of affordability. But we, you know, like I said, we have to ask a big question. Are we going to subsidize the private sector to build affordable housing, purchase or rents, or are we going to proceed to do it ourselves? And if so, what does that mean? Because that actually asks a whole range of questions. And also, we're going to have an honest conversation about who's going to build it. Yes, let's increase and improve our apprenticeship program. We're going to have to increase immigration for those key skills that are needed to fulfill infrastructural, economic infrastructure, the objectives of economic infrastructure, housing, and retrofitting. But also, if you're very serious about, you know, if you're very serious about creating that supply, which can then be organized into residential house building, you've got to look at restricting other type of building projects on a temporary basis. Is it hotels? Is it commercial offices? Is it data centers? And how much labor can we release to put into residential housing? So I think those 3 areas, housing, utilities, again, stuff that I said about reshaping the market, or another issue, and this is a long-term issue in utilities, but we have to start now. We are at a situation where we nearly have no offshore wind farms, even though we have the richest resources of offshore wind to drive energy. It's just incredible. You'd have to work to create that kind of situation. So, you know, let's have an Arden Krishna moment. Let's not go around tweaking tariff guarantees or tweaking it or tweaking that. A public sector body, whether it's ESB or whether it's some other agency, should lead a consortium, which would involve private capital, which would involve academics and research and all that, but they should lead this consortium and just go out and build the damn things. Hook them up to a grid that has been modernized to take that additional energy. Again, we have the money for it. That's not an issue. But for some reason, we just seem to be lumbered with market-led principles rather than just taking a direct route of public sector provision. That's what I meant, good old-fashioned supply-side socialism.
Very good, Michael. I see we have Tom Fitzgerald with his hand up. Tom, do you want to ask or make a comment?
Yes, thanks very much, Tom. Thanks very much, Michael. Brilliant as ever, Michael. Remorseless logic, I have to say. Excellent and very entertaining as always. Fair play to you. It's really good. And there's loads of takeaways from ourselves in terms of arguments back in workplaces and so on and so forth. I suppose that last point as you talk about, Michael, about the trade union movement, taking the initiative for 2027. I suppose just a point in that it's not an economic question per se, or maybe it is, but your views on it, I'd like to hear it, is that because I've heard a lot within the Congress about, if we approach this like the hospitality lobby, what they've done over the last couple of years, we might have, a better impact. I think our starting points are different, of course, because if the hospitality lobby, well, they're obviously preaching to the converted and their own. I think from our point of view, because by that logic, if you accept that, well, then we have to become better lobbyists. We have to have, get more stuff in social media, more stuff. To my mind, actually, we should do that. I get that. But we also have to be able to shape some sort of threat of instability. There has to be some consequence of not listening to the trade union movement. And obviously, that, to my mind, that flows from where workers move into struggle. Regardless of what the struggle is, where it is, the movement has to be up and in behind those workers, because we need to be able to point to that as being how we conduct. Because I just don't think we'll be able to influence government with just a lobbying approach, I suppose. So that's a general point I want to make. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive, those 2 points. I don't think you disagree. And things like Arden Crusher moments and all those bits and pieces, that they're really interesting. I suppose I think there's an argument to have, a department for construction, a national construction company, and until we treat housing like we treated COVID, we're not going to address the problem in any way. But a question, and I don't know if NERI has done work on this, what have you any insight into the public land that's available for that type of argumentation? That, you know what I mean, if you could neatly say, well, this is what's available, we have the resources, we have the finance, it's about political will, political choice. You'd probably not be able to answer that now, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. Thanks very much, and thanks again for today. It's excellent. Could we get the slides? It's always be helpful in arguments in the workplace. Usual question. Thanks again.
Okay, well, I'll very briefly respond, because Tom, you asked about the holding of public land. Is that correct? Your last.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be all sorts of figures. I mean, it was an original estimate that 160,000 houses could be built on what's already held in public land. The Land Development Agency has said 66,000. Now, interesting, there was an analysis done, published in the journal, that showed the two listed top development companies, I can't remember their names, had holdings, a land bank of 34,000 units on developed land, just waiting there. They hadn't started building, but had been rezoned, had been zoned land, 34,000. There seems to be, first off, the numbers seem to be quite wide, and there seems to be some disagreement over what they might be. But also, let's just not assume that we're talking about just public land. We're also talking about private land, which is not either being utilized sufficiently or is being held on to keep the prices up. Because, if you keep supply if you keep supply low or minimal, just ticking over, you're going to your margin is going to improve every year. And I just say this, whatever about, it's a very provocative suggestion about, using our industrial strength to convince the government, even though I think, we'd all agree that it's going to be very hard to convince this government. There is something, this goes beyond the purviews of just looking at budget 2026, but it would be something for budget 3031. That is the trade union movement is going to have to ask itself, how are we going to mobilize our members, mobilize their family members, mobilize retired members, and mobilize public opinion, which is largely supportive of trade unions? How are we going to mobilize that into an alternative progressive government? We can no longer stand on the sidelines while there's an election going on. We have values and principles. With the new economic model, we are starting to put in place a coherent economic and social model. We have some great work done by trade unions throughout SIPTU. How are we going to be able to use that? How are we able to use that to get essentially to ensure that we have a government that's going to listen to those values and principles, that will take seriously our proposals and our analysis? I think that's the fundamental question between now and the next election.
Thanks, Michael. Just to say, on Tom's question, the slides will be put up on the NERI website tomorrow, but we can certainly get them emailed out to individuals as well. Seamus Keane is saying that the 1990 Industrial Relations Act needs to be repealed. And I see
We can't hear you, Tom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Paula?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and was really just on foot of what Michael was saying there. The government have done this and gotten away with it because there isn't a radical progressive protest movement in Ireland, and they're not afraid of us, and that's why they've done that. And I think since the start of the new government, when we saw the left unite and come together and attack them over the whole speaking arrangements and that, it kind of offered an opportunity for the left to unite and organise. And right now with the presidential election, like I'm running the social media just for my little patch in Dublin Southwest, or in Dublin South Central. And it's really, really remarkable to see so many from the left and activists. It almost has a feel like repeal, like there's a real energy, because there's very, very few opportunities for people on the left to organise and build and fight for something. And this is just that one example. And what I'm seeing from this, that this isn't the starting point, or the point isn't to get Catherine Connolly elected. The point is, after we flexed our muscle, done our practicing of organising and fighting together, what can we do next? And that's what I think it's the start of a movement, hopefully, that will kind of see what can we do between this year and the next election. Like, how are we going to mobilize, a month before the election, so that the government will see that we are a force to be reckoned with. And on that, in terms of how the far right have taken over and tried to redefine patriotism, this is a real opportunity for the trade union movement to kind of reclaim, well, what does patriotism mean? What does Irish pride mean? And all those examples about the Ardna Crusher moment, all these real opportunities, taking the spirit of the 1916 proclamation and trying to rewrite and reframe and change that narrative. And I think it's a real wasted opportunity if we don't kind of try to do that, because I think there's just a little window of opportunity at the moment to kind of galvanize the energy that's out there among the political left and kind of harmonize that with the trade union movement, so that we can be a force to be reckoned with. And it's just that I'm so angry. Some people may remember me, I have been disabled, and right now I've started back working again, but the work that I do, all it is doing, it is bringing me back up to the poverty level. And very often I don't see the sense of urgency and the anger in the trade union movement that I need to see, that's going to give me hope that, that they're kind of just as much in the fight for me. There's so much despair and a lack of hope there. And I think that there has to be a spark there to challenge that and break that, for people to know that there is actual hope, and the trade union movement is a part of that hope, which is going to change things for the better. And thank you, Michael, so much. It was wonderful to see you again after so many years.
Thanks. Can I just quickly say about Paula? Yeah, I think the universe is trying to tell us something. As you mentioned, two examples of, say, the political left, after the government was sworn in and there was all this kerfuffle with the independents and all that, the opposition parties came together to pursue a common agenda, and that's what they're doing with the Catherine Connolly campaign. This is extremely hopeful. This didn't happen in the opposition parties in the last government, and we should build on that trying to build trust. And we should also build on bringing together that, more cohesive political left with the trade union movement. It's not about one side or another dictating. It's about sharing the ideas. I know that we would be quite anxious to share not only the principles of the new economic model, but far and wide, and not just to political parties. We have to start taking this message to NGOs who work in poverty, in disability, to the environment. This is a broad progressive movement of which the trade union movement can help play a unifying role. So, one should always remain hopeful.
One should, and we are. Tom Healy has 2 questions. Tom, do you want to take the floor?
Thanks, Michael. And I like the supply side socialism, so sounds good. Just 2 quick questions. One about the deficit. The underlying deficit is what is it? It's about 14 billion, I think, for next year, if I remember the figures. And yeah, so I think one of the challenges over the next few years is to see, okay, we're saying that there needs to be more fiscal discipline and responsibility and counter-cyclical measures. So we need to fill that gap. And obviously, something like pay-related social insurance is one way to do that. We're out of line internationally. But I think it's a big gap to close. And that would require a number of budgets, I think, over a number of years. Spending, there might be some areas that you could reallocate spending, but in the main, if anything, we're underspending. I'm sure you'd agree.
Yeah.
Could spend it better. And then the second question is about healthcare. I mean, one of the things that people keep going on about is that we spend too much on health, with no sense of irony or embarrassment, and that we're out of line. This was kind of the message in the IFAC paper, Boston or Berlin. It wasn't as crude as that, but that was the implication. And I think one of the issues there is that the 2-tier health system is grossly inefficient and is driving up spending, as well as other factors, lack of investment in community healthcare. So I think in terms of trying out your idea, Michael, which is very good, of engaging with frontline workers, I think healthcare will be an obvious one, I think, because there's a lot of room there for spending better. Although I can't see how you can reduce spending really, given aging population and other pressures, to be quite honest. But anyway. Yeah.
Excellent points, Tom. I would just say that it's not about reducing spending, it's about spending it more efficiently. And who better to kind of, find those new efficient ways of spending than the people who actually produce the services themselves, who actually oversee it, workers, the men and women in the health service, or indeed in education, or in public transport, or in any company up and down this country. But you're right about spending. I mean, can I just say this? You hear this, oh, we only got 9 billion euros to spend. No, we have a lot more we could spend and still be closing the deficit. It's called tax increases. Or it's called doing something better with the money. For instance, it's going to cost nearly 700 million euros to this VAT cut. 700 million euros would buy you a free public transport system. The government could provide free public transport for 700 million, which would have all sorts of economic, social, and environmental benefits, including the fact that it would leave more money in people's pockets, which would be better than a tax cut, which can then be going out and spent in the domestic economy. So we could actually drive down childcare fees to 30 euros a week for that 700 million. We could actually provide free prescription medicine and still have money left over to significantly raise Medicare card thresholds so that average earners could have access to free GP care. There is a number of ways to proceed, but the idea that we're somehow limited to, this kind of 9 billion or 7 billion or whatever, no, you are limited by the amount of money you raise through taxation, and then the prudent use of that money that you have raised. And that does mean, by the way, yes, and it's over the medium term to close that deficit. You have to allow that revenue would have to increase faster than spending in order to close that deficit. But you can also close that deficit by increasing productivity in both the public and private sector as well.
On that point on productivity, Michael, one of the hopes for the next generation, albeit there's a lot of concerns too in terms of productivity. Obviously, we'll have slower economic growth based on labor supply, population. We'll have an aging population, perhaps less people of working age relative to the size of the population. Higher spending on pensions, healthcare, long-term care. Artificial intelligence as a potential source of efficiency gains in the public sector. Do you see any kind of role for that in education, health, public administration? Is there any scope there from anything that you've seen so far to potentially ease the fiscal clamps that are coming down, not just in Ireland, but all over the world in the 2030s and 2040s? Or do you see that as essentially a pipe dream?
No, I mean, obviously AI can be used to be used in certain procedures and applications that right now people are less efficient at doing. But the problem is, who gets to call that? At the end of the day, the introduction of AI in the workplace is a power relationship between the employers and the employees. Is it used to augment and help labor, to improve labor productivity, to improve outcomes for labor, or is it there to displace and replace labor? Those are questions that we're only beginning to ask in the trade union movement. And I don't think we have a handle on it. I don't have a handle on it.
Yeah.
But I do know that if you look at past examples of the introduction of technology in those sectors or in those countries where it was done with the cooperation of the workers and their agency, the trade union movement, that in many cases, that absorption of new technology has been much more efficient and much more productive than a top-down approach whereby you just displace labor in favor of AI or automation and then find out that you've made some terrible mistakes. Never forget the famous, the Luddites, probably the most unfairly maligned group in industrial relations history. The Luddites, the people who are running the machines, they didn't protest against the machines. They welcomed the machines. And what they were demanding from their employers was that apprentices be allowed to work and to learn their craft on these machines, and that there would be increases in pay and reduction in working hours to absorb the productivity that those machines brought in. And there would still be money left over for the return on capital that's needed, for the owning class, given that we live in a market economy. That was their charter, but of course they lost the debate. And as we know, winners write the history. So all of a sudden we were told, oh, these Luddites, they destroyed machines and all that. Yeah, they did destroy machines after the government, government-backed owners were going to use those machines to clobber the workers. So that's kind of a lesson we have. So we need to, come to speed on AI, find out examples of where AI is being successfully introduced in such a way as to maximize productivity, maximize wages and working conditions, and can actually be used to, in that sense, promote employment. Because to be honest, the less money you have to spend on this, the more money you have to spend on that. So what you're doing is you're creating resources for reinvestment.
No, that all makes sense to me, and I agree. So a final opportunity for people to ask questions, raise their hand. Okay, in that case, Michael, I'd like to thank you once again for an excellent presentation, particularly just 24 hours or slightly more than 24 hours after the budget. I'm sure we'll do this again next year, hopefully with a more progressive budget, a more productive budget. And just on that question on artificial intelligence, just a reminder again that our next presentation, our next seminar is on the 5th of November. That's a Wednesday, 3:30 online. It's Kevin O'Kelly, Industrial Relations and EU Social Policy Researcher, and it is on artificial intelligence, the impact of artificial intelligence on unemployment relations. And given that that is the world that we are coming into, I think it will be a very, very important piece of research. So with that, thank you all for coming along, and hopefully we will see you all in November. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Tom.